just a casual Star Wars fan, you've probably heard the name Grand Admiral Thrawn. He was originally created by the author Timothy Zahn for the Star Wars Expanded Universe, which is now called Legends and separate from the existing canon. However, with projects like the animated series Rebels and more recently, the Ahsoka series, the character of Thrawn has been brought back into canon. But these shows only tell us so much about his character. Where exactly did he come from? How did an alien rank up so quickly within a xenophobic empire? And what was his character like in Legends? Thankfully, all of these questions can be answered through the publishing side of things. But as of me making this video right now, there are actually 11 books between canon and Legends about the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn. So where exactly should you start reading about everyone's favorite reject from the Blue Man Group? Don't worry, because I've got you covered. This is how you should read Grand Admiral Thrawn. And to start off, let's talk about the books that are no longer canon and instead exist within the Legends timeline, which coincidentally are the first books ever written about the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn. So if you want to discover why it was such a big deal as to why this character was being brought over from Legends to canon again, you will definitely get your answers here. Timothy Zahn's original Thrawn trilogy, consisting of the books Heir to the Empire, Dark Force Rising, and The Last Command, are without question some of the most famous Star Wars books ever written, if not the most famous Star Wars books ever written. Now, I probably should say that this trilogy isn't specifically about Thrawn, but it instead follows Luke, Leia, Han, Chewie, and Lando as they rebuild the galaxy following the events of Return of the Jedi. They're basically starting to establish a new Republic and new Jedi Order to help the galaxy grow from years of Imperial control. The only catch and hindrance here is that the tactical genius Grand Admiral Thrawn seeks to reclaim the Empire's tyranny despite Palpatine's death. But there's other characters in this trilogy as well, such as Mara Jade, who worked formerly very close with Emperor Palpatine and has her loyalty tested as she's basically put into a position to where she has to work with the Empire's greatest enemy and someone that she just outright despises, Luke Skywalker. So if you want to learn more about Mara Jade's character, you'll absolutely get that with these books as well. At certain points while reading these books, it genuinely feels like you're reading the Legends equivalent to the sequel trilogy, episodes 7, 8, and 9. Even though Timothy Zahn has stated numerous times that they were never intended to be that or act that way. Again, though, I just want to say that these books are phenomenal reads across the board. Again, they're some of the most, if not the most, iconic Star Wars books to exist for a reason. And I first read these books whenever I was in middle school, and I've read them countless times since, if that's any indicator as to how great these books are actually written. So if you want to find out why the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn made such a massive impression to the Star Wars fandom whenever he was introduced, you absolutely need to read these books. I'm not the first person to recommend them, I know that much, but I do highly recommend giving them a read. However, those aren't the only books about Grand Admiral Thrawn that Timothy Zahn wrote for Legends. Not many people talk about the Hand of Thrawn duology, which closed out the Bantam era, the first era of Star Wars publishing, and these books consist of the books Spectre of the Past and Vision of the Future. And I've got to say that, like, it's insane that nobody talks about these books, because if you're asking me, these might be the best books that Timothy Zahn ever wrote for Star Wars Legends. However, because those two books act as the closing finale for the Bantam era of Star Wars publishing, which was the first real era of publishing for Star Wars books, there is no way that I can talk about them without discussing major spoilers for the first Thrawn trilogy. So if you haven't read those books and you don't want to get spoiled, you can skip to this point in the video to bypass this. But again, if you've read not just the Thrawn trilogy, but the majority of Legends and the majority of the Bantam era, I highly recommend closing it out with these. Somehow, Grand Admiral Thrawn has returned after his apparent death. But by this point, I feel like death is almost an inconvenience for a lot of characters living within this galaxy. But after Grand Admiral Thrawn has somehow returned and very much made himself present, it's up to our heroes to figure out if this is true, how it would be possible if so, and ultimately, how to stop Thrawn once again. But believe it or not, there's actually a lot more to these books than that insane plot. But these two books are excellent reads, and unfortunately, I feel like both of them are just severely underrated and just not talked about nearly as much as they should be. Again, I wouldn't recommend reading these first, as you won't really appreciate them. You'll appreciate them so much more if you've actually read everything else leading up to these books. It's kind of like the Infinity War and Endgame, if you will. But this trilogy and this duology rounds us out for Star Wars Legends books about Thrawn, so let's go ahead and jump into canon. The first canon trilogy of books about Grand Admiral Thrawn consists of these books: Thrawn, Thrawn Alliances, and Thrawn Treason, all again written by Timothy Zahn. And for what it's worth, I'm honestly hesitant to call these books a trilogy because they're not a trilogy in a traditional sense. There's no grand overarching story that carries through all three of these specific books, meaning that you could really read these books in any order that you want to, but I'd still recommend personally going in release order, as I really feel like that was the way that these books were intended to be experienced. That being said and disclaimed, the first book in this trilogy of books is none other than Thrawn, published in 2017. And this book simply acts as a canonical reintroduction for the character of Grand Admiral Thrawn. It's an origin story for the character to an extent, and it explains how he ended up working for and gaining such a high status within the Empire. That book is then followed by Thrawn Alliances, which this book is pretty much 50% Thrawn working with Anakin Skywalker during the Clone Wars, and 50% Vader working with Thrawn during the Galactic Civil War. It's kind of a parallel story, if you will. As you can probably expect from a premise like that, the past definitely comes back in a big way for both of these characters, and there's some really great character interactions throughout the story. The plot is basically Vader and Thrawn walk into a bar, quite literally, and if that piques your interest, then you'll probably quite enjoy this book a lot. It's probably my least favorite book of this trilogy, and honestly probably overall in my personal opinion. I think there's a few pacing issues that really hold it back, because you're trying to balance kind of two stories in one, but overall it's still a super entertaining read. And for what it's worth, as a book that directly ties into Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, I think it's handled extremely well, and that part of the story never comes across as forced. And to round out the first batch of canon Thrawn stories, we have none other than Thrawn Treason, which, if we're being perfectly honest, is one of my personal favorite Star Wars books ever. I really like this one a lot, and on a good day, I might actually consider this to be my favorite Thrawn story. The main synopsis of the book is basically that Thrawn is beefing with none other than Orson Krennic. Where should the Empire put their funding? Should they put it in Thrawn's TIE Defender program and into more Star Destroyers, or do they need to direct those funds into Project Stardust? All of these books within this trilogy of sorts are, above all else, really exciting and intriguing reads, and brought Thrawn back into canon in a really cool way. And knowing that Timothy Zahn was once again able to write for this character and really be the one to help bring Thrawn back into canon from Legends, it just makes these books even better. But there's still one big question left. Where did Grand Admiral Thrawn come from? You'll find your answer in the Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, once again written by none other than Timothy Zahn. The trilogy consists of Chaos Rising, which personally I loved, Lesser Evil, which I found to be okay, and Greater Good, which I ended up really enjoying. And these books are not just a casual dive into Thrawn's time before the Empire, it's really just about the Chiss Ascendancy and their culture. The biggest compliment that I can give all of these books is that if you remove the Star Wars label from all three of these books, you would honestly still have a great science fiction trilogy. Creatively, they just feel so distinct and unique compared to the galaxy far, far away that I feel like we're all too familiar with. There's honestly only really one big connection that I can think of that kind of has to happen, and that is in the first book. I don't want to spoil it because it kind of blew my mind whenever I read it, because word for word it connects to another book. It's really interesting, and if you know, you know. However, these books do still have that military sci-fi feel that you would expect from a character like Grand Admiral Thrawn. That definitely carries over, I feel like, across the board between all of the books we've discussed. And for what it's worth, if you want to start with canon, I recommend reading these books first, the first canon Thrawn trilogy, before you start the Ascendancy trilogy. This is a much deeper dive into things that are briefly discussed in this trilogy. I honestly want to reread the Ascendancy trilogy books again sometime soon because I feel like I might appreciate them even more. With the exception of the Hand of Thrawn duology, I feel like any of the other books that I've mentioned are honestly a great place to start reading about this character. However, that is a decision that I cannot make. It is ultimately up to you. So if you want to learn more about Grand Admiral Thrawn outside of Rebels and outside of the Ahsoka series, that is how you can start. That being said, have you read any of these Thrawn books? And if so, which one was your favorite and why? I'd love to know down in the comments below. And until we lightspeed skip to the next video, may the Force be with you.